The pursuit of happiness. It's highly unlikely that you haven't come across this phrase at some point in your life. If you're an American, you should know that this phrase is most commonly associated with the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. But from my experience, it also seems highly unlikely that you've ever been told what this phrase actually means. Personally, I have never had a single teacher or anyone else I know be able to explain the phrase to me. Oh sure, they might know that the phrase is derivative of John Locke's life, liberty, and estate, but they've never been able to explain to me the substance of the pursuit of happiness. So let's start with the origin of the phrase. As you might already know, Thomas Jefferson seemed to come up with the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by means of John Locke. According to Locke, life, liberty, and estate, or property, form the trinity of natural rights fundamental to human freedom and flourishing, and that governments are instituted to protect. But Locke's particular phrasing doesn't mean that he didn't occupy himself with the idea of happiness either. In fact, in John Locke's own writings, he seemed to have been the first to actually coin the phrase. As he writes in his essay concerning human understanding, the necessity of pursuing true happiness is the foundation of liberty, as therefore the highest perfection of intellectual nature lies in a careful and constant pursuit of true and solid happiness, so the care of ourselves that we mistake not imaginary for real happiness is the necessary foundation of our liberty. The stronger ties we have to an unalterable pursuit of happiness in general, which is our greatest good, and which, as such, our desires always follow, the more we free from any necessary determination of our will to any particular action, and from a necessary compliance with our desire, set upon any particular and then appearing preferable good, till we have duly examined whether it has a tendency to, or be inconsistent with, our real happiness. But while this is just one likely source from which the phrase comes from, we tend to forget that the entire basis for the Declaration of Independence came largely from George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, almost to the point of a word-for-word copy, which isn't surprising since Jefferson had it with him when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. But as Mason wrote in his declaration, that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. You can find the same thing in the Pennsylvania Declaration of Rights, in the Constitution of Massachusetts, the Constitution of Vermont, in the first congressional debates over the Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers, in private letters and various pamphlets, the writings of Jean-Jacques Burle-Marquis, Sir William Blackstone, Alexander Pope, and Meredith Vattel. Needless to say, the idea of happiness was on the minds of a lot of people during the founding era. So it's not 100% clear where the phrase comes from in intellectual history. Okay, so what does the pursuit of happiness mean? Well, let's start with what it's not. Many people see the word happiness and they take it to mean anything that simply gives you joy. So if you get joy out of watching TV all day, you are pursuing happiness. Or if you get joy out of getting drunk every Friday night, you are pursuing happiness. Or any other temporary feeling of psychological pleasure. No. In these cases, you may be pursuing what you think is good or what you like, but you are not pursuing happiness properly understood. This is what we call a fleeting or temporal happiness in the words of William Blackstone. But this is not any kind of happiness with substance. Another thing that happiness is not is a right. You don't have a right to happiness, you have a right to pursue happiness. Because to pursue it means that you must choose to pursue it, and it is not always a guarantee that you will achieve it. So okay, what is happiness then? Well, when the word happiness was being used back then, it was being used as a synonym to the Greek word eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is what the founders were talking about when they spoke of happiness. As a literal translation, eudaimonia means to have a good daimon, the daimon being the soul. So how do you obtain eudaimonia? What are the implications of it? Well, I just mentioned before all the various sources where one could find the topic of happiness being discussed. But the person who first committed to a serious investigation of the idea, because he wrote a whole book on the subject, was Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. So let's start with that. What is ethics? Well, ethics is just a way of living oriented towards some defined good. And because everything you do in life, every choice you make, every action you take, is done because you think it is in some form or other a good thing to do, this constitutes your ethics. But when you study ethics, when you think about the purpose of ethics, what you're really studying is how to have a good character. How to lead the best possible life you can for yourself. And leading the best possible life involves making certain choices and taking certain actions that are aiming at the good, which implies that some actions and choices are better than other actions and choices. And the repetition of these actions and choices are the habits that shape your character. And what is character? Well, the Greek roots of character can be found in the word choresein, and choresein means to etch, to engrave. That is what your character is. It is something you have engraved onto your soul. And the reason why you study ethics, or how to have the type of character that is aligned with the good, is to be happy. And you cannot be happy unless you embody certain moral virtues that become engraved onto your soul through repeated habits. But what are those moral virtues? And what is virtue? Starting with virtue, the ancient Greek word for the concept is arete, which can also be translated as excellence. And according to Aristotle, arete both brings that of which it is the arete into a good condition and causes the work belonging to that thing to be done well. Or as the political philosopher Harry Jaffa put it, virtue in classical terms is what makes a man capable of good and noble actions. It is a necessary means to the good life, but it is, at the same time, intrinsic to the good life. As an element of human perfection or happiness, it is not merely instrumental. So virtue concerns the things that allows human beings to flourish, to be brought into the best condition that we can possibly be in. And the virtues are particular to human beings as human beings. And according to Aristotle, they come in two forms. Virtue is twofold, intellectual and moral. Both the coming into being and increase of intellectual virtue result mostly from teaching, hence it requires experience and time, whereas moral virtue is the result of habit. And so it is that moral virtue got its name, ethike, by a slight alteration of the term habit, ethos. But if virtue requires both teaching and the cultivation of habits, then it also means that virtue is not natural to our being. But that does not mean that it is contrary to our nature. If virtue was just naturally a part of us, then we would be exuding it every day. Each person would simply be the best that they could be and all would be flourishing. But then the word virtue would also become utterly meaningless, and it would just be more apt to call virtuous behavior the natural behavior of human beings. But since they are not natural to us, the virtues are instead present in us who are of such a nature as to receive them, and who are completed through habit. But if virtue is not naturally present in human beings, how do we cultivate it? How do we attach it to our being or engrave it onto our soul? How can we discover these virtues? Well, what are all human beings born capable of doing? We're all capable of talking, which means we're all capable of talking about things that we can identify, which means that we can not only communicate, but we can think about those things. All human beings are born with the ability to reason. It is natural only to human beings. There is no other creature on this planet capable of talking and reasoning about things. And this is one of the most significant aspects of human nature. If we can think and reason about things, then that would suggest that our capacity for reason lies at the higher end of a hierarchy of all the other aspects of human nature. Our passions, our appetites, our desires. And if we can reason about things, then that means that our reason is capable of controlling and disciplining those lower parts of our nature. It means that when we really want to eat another piece of cake, we can reason to ourselves, no, I really shouldn't, and I won't. It means that when we really don't want to study for that final, we can reason to ourselves, well, if I don't study, I might fail the exam. Okay, fine. Now this also means that our reason or our judgment is inseparable from the specific thing we are desiring. You're not a robot, all humans have desires. But some virtues cannot be practiced without the presence of certain desires and without the exertion of reason to properly discern those desires. But the fact that we can deliberate about these things and think about the connection to what is actually good for us means that the virtues are things that we can and must actively think about. As Harvard professor Harvey Mansfield writes, virtue is reasoned, reflective, deliberate, rather than spontaneous. Even when virtue is a habit, as Aristotle said of moral virtue, it needs the help of reason to gain control and to defend itself. And why do we do any of this? Because virtue is inseparable from human happiness, and all humans want to be happy. If every action we take is aimed at some good, and if there exists a hierarchy of those goods, by studying ethics, by thinking about the complete human life, by thinking about the moral virtues and by embodying those virtues through the repetition of good habits, we can develop the kind of character that allows us to be the best selves we can be, which is in the end all for the purpose of achieving happiness. And there's our definition of eudaimonia. Eudaimonia, or happiness, is the end state of having lived a life of human flourishing in accordance with right reason and the moral virtues. It is a state of utter life satisfaction. It is a completeness of soul. It doesn't mean that you'll be out there every day with a big smile on your face. But it does mean that you have chosen to engage in a way of life that is maximally intended to lead forth the best and most noble aspects of your being. It may very well be accompanied by happiness as the fleeting and temporal sensation, but at the core, it is a kind of happiness with real substance and real meaning. So when we think back to the Declaration of Independence, and to the words that all men are endowed by their Creator with the unalienable right to the pursuit of happiness, this is the kind of happiness they were talking about. All of this. As Benjamin Franklin wrote, "Without virtue, man can have no happiness in this world." Thomas Jefferson wrote that the order of nature exists in such a way that individual happiness shall be inseparable from the practice of virtue. John Adams, "Happiness can never be found without virtue." And as George Washington said in his first inaugural address, "There is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness." These are some of the most Aristotelian statements you will ever find. But very often, the pursuit of happiness is not an easy thing to do, partly because the strength of your desires may be too overwhelming in your ability to reason and control them. Moreover, if you are trying to live a virtuous life, you have to make trade-offs. And you'll come to recognize that there are in fact trade-offs in life between what you desire and what is actually in accordance with virtue and the highest good. When Benjamin Franklin made a list of 13 virtues that he hoped to be better at embodying, he would put a mark next to the virtue he was working on if he thought that he failed to fully achieve it that day. You'll notice he's got a couple of marks there. It's not the easiest thing to do, and this tension is best reflected between the demands of virtue and the temptation of our appetites. So the appetites are that part of our being that deals with what is pleasant and what is painful. It deals with appetency, our desires and longings. So it's something like hunger. When you're hungry, you are experiencing a kind of pain. But when you indulge in food like an animal in order to cure yourself of that hunger, you are taking the pleasure of eating way too far and are becoming a slave to your appetite. Other appetites deal with the sensual pleasures, indulging your desires for wealth or sex, or simply living with no constraints on your self-expression. The impulses of those lacking self-restraint are toward things contrary to their reason. The type of person who lives only by their passions were described by Aristotle as living the life of fatted cattle. This is what any classical thinker would have described as a state of slavery. Slavery to yourself, to your basest appetites, and letting it take over your capacity for reason and your potential as a human being. And this is because fatted cattle have no use for reason. They have no use for knowledge, because these things would lead them to start considering virtue, which means that they actually have to take a serious look at their own lives. And yet, as Aristotle wrote, most people, or the many, do not do the activities that lead to virtue. And, seeking refuge in argument, they suppose that they are philosophizing and that they will in this way be serious, thereby doing something similar to the sick who listen attentively to their physicians, but do nothing prescribed. When Socrates talked about tyrants in the Republic, Plato had him say that they are those who know not wisdom and virtue, and are always busy with gluttony and sensuality. And because of this, they are like brute animals, with their eyes down and bodies bent to the earth or leaning on the dining table. They fatten and feed and breed, and, in their excessive love of these delights, they kick and butt at one another with horns and hooves which are made of iron, and they kill one another by reason of their insatiable lust, for they fill themselves with that which is not substantial, and the part of themselves which they fill is also unsubstantial and incontinent. Incontinent, or uncontrolled, unbridled, a lack of self-restraint, a state of slavery to your desires and appetites. So basically, if your idea of a good time is getting so drunk that you spend the next day puking your guts out, you are an utter slave to your appetites, to your passions. The same goes for other substances that inhibit your ability to reason. Every time you hear someone recount their story of a trip, you are hearing someone who has lost their ability to reason, who has lost that higher part of the brain in favor of their slavery to pleasure, and you are flattering all the worst aspects of yourself.
Are our appetites, our desires, undermining us? Is the cart in front of the horse?
And Socrates seemed to believe that he was created in order to stop this. When I say that I am given to you by God, the proof of my mission is this. If I had been like other men, I should not have neglected my own concerns or patiently seen the neglect of them during all these years, and I've been doing yours, coming to you individually like a father or elder brother, exhorting you to regard virtue. What this ultimately means is that you must choose to pursue virtue. You must choose to examine your life, because without choosing to do so, you will not achieve happiness. And this is partly where we get the phrase, virtue not freely chosen is not virtuous. Or you can decide otherwise. You can decide to be guided by your passions. You can want and need and fall into fits of appetency. You can instead live the licentious life chained to your immediate desires and make no thought of the noble things in life. But don't think that you can call that any meaningful kind of happiness. Which gets us to another important distinction here between liberty and license. When people speak of liberty, or sometimes of freedom, outside of the strictly negative political use of the word, they mean that word in the sense of having zero constraints on their life behavior whatsoever, to literally indulge in whatever you want to indulge in. For as long as human beings have been engaged in the art of philosophy, that has not been the definition of liberty. Living a life with absolutely zero constraints, with absolutely no thought for virtue, is called licentiousness. And this becomes clear once you think about what virtue does for a human being. Again, the virtues are the qualities that best form your character so you can live a flourishing life. You are literally learning or habituating yourself into becoming a free man. A state of liberty is reached when you are sufficiently embodying the virtues, because what we're really being liberated from are those slave pleasures, those appetites that consistently bring you down and away from right reason and your potential for excellence. In the political context, or liberty as a negative, this has generally meant freedom from an oppressive state preventing you from doing things such as thinking, or choosing, or speaking, or worshipping, or the things that you would otherwise need in order to pursue happiness within the political community and civil society. Lord Acton phrased it this way: liberty is not a means to a higher political end, it is itself the highest political end. It is not for the sake of a good public administration that it is required, but for security in the pursuit of the highest objects of civil society and of private life. Now, when we look at how best to practice the moral virtues, there isn't exactly a set rulebook for that, though we are offered a fair amount of choices. And with some of these choices, the ways in which the moral virtues are practiced can even alter the contents of what makes up the noblest virtues. And this is one of the perennial features of Western civilization, in that we're to consider the highest virtues for man can always be contemplated and debated, that we can try to figure out the principles most conducive to the good life. Plato wrote that the chief virtues were justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude. And later, St. Paul would add on to those with his theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity, thus forming the 7 virtues of the schoolmen. If you read the Nicomachean Ethics, you'll know that Aristotle has his 11 virtues, which he comes to define by following his golden mean, or the middle state between that which is deficient and that which is excessive. Of these, he lists courage, moderation, liberality, magnificence, greatness of soul, ambition, gentleness, truthfulness, wittiness and tact, friendliness, and justice, the proper application of which are described in the Ethics, and is probably a good place to start if you're interested in more. Later on in the Hellenistic era, we saw the rise of more practical life philosophies. Epicureanism was one example. It was founded by Epicurus in 307 BC, and was primarily centered around living a life of mental tranquility and ease. He taught that you shouldn't be worried about death and the wrath of gods, and that the absence of disturbance was the key to true pleasure. Hence, one ought to stay away from things like politics or the pursuit of various passions, and stick to developing your friendships and other meaningful relationships. Another alternative was Stoicism. Compared to Epicureanism, Stoicism prohibited the isolationist life. It taught that one ought to pursue excellence in life, and that in order to accomplish such goals, you needed to live your life in harmony with the divine rationality of the universe. This meant cultivating a sense of justice, courage, temperance, and right reason. Cultivating your reason would help to reveal a cosmos that was rightly ordered and meaningful, thus serving as a model for human behavior and striving for the good. And, as Aristotle taught, because all human communities strive for the good, one ought to engage in politics in order to cultivate that good. Pursuing these ends with endurance and self-control would ultimately lead to inner tranquility. The Romans also had their own ideas, such as virtus, or virtus if you're a reconstructed pronunciation kind of person, which means manly virtue. This included strength, loyalty, courage, wisdom, and moral purity. The poet Lucilius described it this way: virtus is to know the human relevance of each thing, to know what is humanly right and useful and honorable, and what things are good and what are bad, useless, shameful, and dishonorable. And, in addition, virtus is putting the country's interests first, then our parents with our own interests third and last. Fides, or faithfulness, was similarly held to high regard. This meant keeping to one's obligations, whether to the gods, to the community, or to the virtues that pertain to each sex. Or we can also follow in the steps of Cicero. We may find that studying philosophy leads to the best form of life, and philosophy is a way of life, a life of deep contemplation. You do not live like other people if you're a philosopher, and you may find that approaching the virtues through the philosophic life is more meaningful or conducive for happiness. As Cicero wrote, and as Ben Franklin repeats in his own autobiography, "O philosophy, guide of life, O searcher out of virtue and exterminator of vice, One day spent well and in accordance with thy precepts is worth an immortality of sin. We can also find an expression of the virtues in Judaism and Christianity, which, in the Western canon, the Christian texts are just as important for coming to a more complete understanding of human existence as are all the pagan texts. Today, the study of both, with an emphasis on Christianity, would probably fall under the field of Christian humanism. But this is not to exclude any Eastern texts, which are also worth studying. But obviously in the West, Christianity has played a much more important role. And if you take revealed religion seriously, you'll come to find that it is totally possible that the moral virtues can also be delivered to us by divine revelation, or by God, faith, and the Holy Spirit, in a form that is more palatable than mere reason. After all, it was God who revealed to Moses the 10 Commandments, and it was by the divine example of Jesus that we get his moral teachings. Though this doesn't mean that our rational faculties can't also apprehend divine revelation, because if God is the first cause, or the unmoved mover, the author of revelation, then our capacity for reason must also have come from that first cause and can mediate between the space of revelation and human reason. Both reason and faith can be complementary in this area. Where there are deficiencies in reason, faith can come to its aid, and where faith is imperfect, reason can help attain some grasp of what is to be understood. But Galatians 5 in particular lays out some important virtues. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law, and they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. And I think it's perfect that these virtues are listed under the fruit of the Spirit. Because what is fruit? I mean, what do fruits do? They grow, they develop, and they mature. And so these virtues aren't just things that one exudes. Like all the others, they have to be cultivated. They're a part of one's character that must be developed. And in the Christian context, these fruits were embodied by Christ himself. And so it is by his example and by divine grace and the Holy Spirit that you may follow in the same path and achieve happiness. And much like all the other ancients, the Bible similarly warns against becoming a slave to your appetites or your flesh. This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary the one to the other, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would. But if ye be led of the Spirit, ye are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revellings, and such like. Of the which I tell you before, as I have also told you in time past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. The Islamic philosopher Al-Farabi also recognized the importance of noble virtues for the human condition, writing in his Virtuous City that the forms and states of character from which these noble activities emanate are the virtues. They are not goods for their own sake, but goods only for the sake of happiness, which must have the input of reason. But now we need to go back to the American founding, because of the utmost importance to the framers was the creation of a new form of government that would allow people the greatest freedom to exercise their unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is where the Declaration of Independence is raised beyond the status of just a mere declaration, but a work of human excellence, because you cannot move beyond the principles of the Declaration without going backwards. Are you really going to say that all men are not created equal? Are you really going to say that all men do not have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Calvin Coolidge basically summed up the perennial truth of the Declaration in his speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. About the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress in 1776, that we have had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward the time where there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers. So this is the greatest document for human liberty that man has ever created. But what form of government best secures those rights? Certainly not what they had in England, that's obvious. But what the framers ultimately settled on was a republic. Why a republic? Well, first, we need to remember just how much the framers and the ideas of our country were influenced by the Roman Republic. I mean, we have something called the Senate. Our White House, Supreme Court, and Capitol building all take architectural influence from the Romans. Our newspapers often have the word tribune in them. We have a city named after Cincinnatus, and the colonists frequently took Roman pseudonyms in their writings, such as Trenchard and Gordon writing under Cato's letters, or the Federalist Papers under the name of Publius. But in the area of the republican form of government, one of the most important ideas to come out of the Roman Republic was the concept of citizenship and its accompanying public spiritedness. But we need to take a step back. When people generally think of Rome, they tend to think of colosseums and pantheons. But what they don't remember is that those things were constructed during the time of the Roman Empire. The Republic didn't have these things, and what was valued by the framers about Rome was its republican qualities. Because in a republic, you have citizens, in an empire, you have subjects. Take the Latin word for republic, res publica, which means a public affair, or the people's affairs, the people's business. This means that citizens are involved in one form or another in their own government, in their own affairs, that they have the agency to be self-governing. In Rome, this was represented by the tribune, where the people, or the plebeians, could be distinctly represented in government in contrast to the patricians in the Senate. But the idea of being a self-governing citizen was huge for the founders, because in contrast to monarchy, a republican citizen has control over their own destiny. And that citizenship comes with certain responsibilities that a citizen is able to handle because by the nature of having a republican form of government, they are assumed to have the requisite virtues needed for self-governance and its accompanying freedom. This is very much what Shakespeare may have been referring to in Julius Caesar, when Cassius says, "Men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." Cassius is warning Brutus that Caesar is going to be a tyrant, that if he gets into power, he is going to remove the human agency that is inherent to the Republic, that quality that allows them to be masters of their fates. As UVA professor Paul Cantor writes, Shakespeare understood that the strength of the Republic rested on the confidence of its citizens that their fate was largely in their own hands, and that it was up to them and in their power to accomplish great deeds in the world. Under a monarchy, or the Roman Empire, when you become a subject, when there is no popular sovereignty, you are left to the whim of the emperor, and you succumb to the helplessness of your own condition, whether or not it is true that you are helpless. Merely the belief that one ought to submit to their fate, or that one cannot escape their condition in life, is enough to destroy human agency. This was a big part of the subtext of Tacitus's Agricola, where he wrote about the social changes of life in the empire. We've provided a grand specimen of submissiveness. We have experienced the depths of servitude. Indolence indeed has a charm of its own, to which we gradually yield, and we end up by loving the inaction that we at first hated. This is why the virtue of courage is so emphasized for the people living under a tyrannical regime. It takes courage to stand up to submissiveness. And so when the framers convened in 1787 to form a more perfect union, they intentionally set out to create a republic. But what kind of republic? Not a monarchic republic, not an aristocratic republic, not an oligarchic republic, but a democratic republic. Today, these words have become so intertwined that when one simply speaks of a republic, it is assumed that he means a form of government that respects civil liberties and democratic norms. And when one speaks of a democracy, it is assumed that they mean it in the context of a representative republic that still embodies the republican spirit. Hamilton would even describe the Constitution as being a representative democracy. And nothing describes this new constitution better than the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. These papers were written with the explicit intention, among many, of vindicating the Constitution from the charges that it was anti-republican. But first, let's start with the name that they wrote the essays under. There is a reason why these guys chose the pseudonym Publius. Many don't remember this, but before the Federalist Papers were published, there was another pseudonymous author writing under the name of Caesar in defense of the newly drafted Constitution. We think it might have been Alexander Hamilton, but given all the evidence we have, it doesn't seem likely. Either way, the essays released under Caesar didn't take off so well. And once you compare who the actual Caesar was to who Publius was, this kind of makes sense. In Plutarch's Lives, Publius Valerius was so loved by the people that he was given the name Publicola, which means the people's friend or people lover. And the reason why they loved him so much was because he helped to overthrow the monarchy and found the republic. And so it's very fitting that the writings under Caesar failed to launch compared to the writings of Publius. Because as Martin Diamond writes, Caesar destroyed a republic, Publius saved one. So the essays under the Federalist Papers already have some good Republican marketing going for them. But the contention made by Publius is that they have created a constitution that maintains a republican form of government, all the while curing the disease endemic to republics by embodying the principles of representation, the separation of powers, protection from oppressive majorities through a multiplicity of factions and self-interest, the enlargement of the orbit of the republic, and by preserving the spirit and the form of popular government. In 85 essays, they stake their defense of the Constitution in some of the most significant writings of political science we've ever seen. But they also made another contention, that the people ought to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue the common good of the society. Now that presupposes that the people themselves are of such high character that they can discern who possesses the most wisdom to discern and the most virtue to pursue the common good of the society. Which gets us to the most significant aspect of the republican form of government. If the American people are expected to be self-governing, then they need to be habituated into certain kinds of behaviors and habits. These behaviors and habits are encompassed by what we call the Republican virtues. If you recall, virtues are those qualities that allow something to be brought in its best condition and to perform its function well. So the Republican virtues are the qualities that make the Republican form of government function well and perform its work with excellence. To this end, the Republican virtues are generally understood to encompass popular sovereignty, liberty, civic virtue, and public spiritedness. And these Republican virtues presuppose other virtues as well: prudence, self-restraint, truthfulness, diligence, goodwill, and a whole host of others. Because in a large republic with millions of people, you are not going to get a uniformity of opinion on political matters. Sometimes your personal interests will be at odds with the public interest, and so you have to go about the political process with a much more temperate, deliberative, and humble approach. Pluralism will always be a feature of American life because we have such a diversity of thought in this country by the very nature of its existence. But more to the importance of virtue in a republic, as Publius writes in Federalist 55, Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousy of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-governance, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another. And this is because, as Harvey Mansfield notes, self-government isn't just a gift. It requires judgment, tact, participation, and individual cultivation. There is a reason why Federalist 1 tries to promote the idea of establishing good government by reflection and choice. Because to reflect on something is to think about something, to make sure that what you are doing is right, to make sure that what you are doing is good, that you have thought through all the alternatives and trade-offs, that you have consulted the fundamental principles, and that you ultimately make your decision, make your choice, and participate in the act of self-government. But take the importance of virtue from the founders. From George Washington, virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. Ben Franklin, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become more corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. John Adams, religion and virtue are the only foundations, not only of republicanism and of all free government, but of social felicity under all government and in all combinations of human society. James Madison, to suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. And as George Mason wrote in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, no free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue. But let's dig into the importance of each of these Republican virtues, starting with popular sovereignty. This is essentially synonymous with the idea of the consent of the governed. We, the people, agree to place a government over ourselves because we recognize that government, or specifically the government under the Constitution, is the best structure to protect our natural rights. And those who govern do so at our pleasure, because we, the people, give it power. Now, of course, at the time of the founding, these principles were not equally applied to everyone. The idea of representation and popular sovereignty sounds like a joke to the slave or to the average woman of this period. And it would only be through time, powerful rhetoric, courage, and a lot of bloodshed that the natural rights of human beings would finally reach all citizens of this country. But only by bringing the principles of the Declaration out into the public and showing where society was ignoring them would they be fully lived up to. Those who still embody racist and sexist thoughts are particularly egregious determinists, because these people do not believe in the human conscience. They deny that some human beings are moral creatures, or even fully human, and hence they fail to have any perspective on human dignity and justice. This stain on the founding is recognized by most people today as the original sin of the nation. But for the purposes of a well-functioning republic, you cannot dispense with popular sovereignty. liberty. Now, the Revolutionary period had two conceptions of liberty. As C. Bradley Thompson writes, there is liberty as a volitional fact of human nature, and liberty as a moral requirement for human flourishing. With volitional liberty, we look at what man is as a creature. We are thinking creatures. We are creatures with a moral sensibility. We have the capacity for reason. We are able to choose and to act on our choices. We are not just beasts. We have free will and agency, and that agency is informed by our morality, which means that we make moral choices. In this sense, liberty is the capacity to choose between right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust. Or as the Reverend Levi Hart said in a 1774 sermon, liberty is a power of action, or a certain suitableness or preparedness for exertion, and a freedom from or hindrance from any external cause. Liberty, when predicated of a man as a moral agent and accountable creature, is that suitableness or preparedness to be the subject of volitions, or exercises of will, with reference to moral objects, by the influence of motives, which we find belongeth to all men of common capacity, and who are come to the years of understanding. This type of liberty is probably best reflected in the demands for the freedom of conscience and religious rights. Or another example would be the backlash against prior restraint and licensing requirements for publishing print materials, something you'd find in Milton's Areopagitica. Being able to think, to discourse, and to act on your choices is the purpose of volitional liberty as being in accord with human nature. And to this end, the laws must also reflect the proper boundaries of volitional liberty and be sure to respect a man's right to private property, because private property is the foundation of becoming your own man. As John Adams wrote, the protection of private property indeed implies liberty, because property cannot be secure unless the man be at liberty to acquire, use, or part with it at his discretion, and unless he have his personal liberty of life and limb, motion and rest for that purpose. James Harrington and Rousseau were both adamant that you cannot be a free person unless you are self-governing. And if we're expected to govern ourselves, then we must have the volitional liberty to be able to do so. Again, this is not liberty as license, or doing whatever you want with no restraints on your behavior and living like a beast. That is slavery to yourself. Volitional liberty is a liberty that is required for political ends as responsible citizens. Now, the moral requirement of liberty was for the end of human flourishing, something much more in line with our previous discussions on virtue. As John Milton would write in his Second Defense, to form and increase virtue, the most excellent thing is liberty. Rousseau would also write that there can be no patriotism without liberty, no liberty without virtue, and no virtue without citizens. And as noted earlier from George Mason, no free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue. You need these things in order to have these things. Or as Gordon S. Wood writes in The Radicalism of the American Revolution, liberty was realized when the citizens were virtuous, that is, willing to sacrifice their private interests for the sake of the community, including serving in public office without pecuniary rewards. Which gets us to our next Republican virtue, the civic virtues. Now this is where you come in. This is where the idea of self-government really comes into action. The civic virtues solely concern how to be a good citizen, how to interact with people, how to participate in government, and how to cultivate the habits best suitable for these tasks. Now in the founding, this was more or less synonymous with the idea of public virtue or disinterestedness, in distinction to private interest or private desires, which were purely selfish. But as Robert A. Goldwyn writes, the founders had in mind town councils, state legislatures, jury duty, voting for local, state, and federal officials, lobbying, organizing interest groups, as part of the activities that cultivate the civic virtues. And given that the Republic was established under the principles of a decentralist federalism, these activities take place first and foremost in your own local community. As Martin Diamond writes, they are the daily things, the intra-regime things, that make up the vast bulk of a government's business, the little things, immensely interesting to most men, which may be done safely and salutarily by the locality in whatever way it chooses. And this is exactly what our Constitution was designed to facilitate and accommodate. This is what it means to have decentralized institutions. That the responsibility of self-government is in the hands of you, your community, and your local government before it is the responsibility of your state or the federal government. That the local institutions of your family, neighborhood, community, church, volunteer organization, your workplace, the PTA, and local government should be the first responders to the vast majority of decisions that are made in your life, because that's literally where you live your life. You don't live your life on the national scale. That is both unnatural and impossible. And some might even say tyrannical, because you cannot be adequately represented on such a large scale. You live your life in whatever small corner of the country it is that you live in, with whatever relationships and interactions that you have in that small corner of the country. The sheer size of America and the diversity of people living here makes this one of the most accommodating systems to live your life with your community of people in the best way you see fit, barring any obvious discriminatory practices or violations of natural rights, or basically the Constitution as amended. Or to put it in a different way, the people of Eugene, Oregon do not live the same way as the Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They have different norms, customs, values, entire ways of living. Our decentralized and federalist constitution allows for this diversity of communities because we are not a homogeneous nation. Some people want to live differently from others, and some people will pursue different policies which they believe is best for the community. But the point is, the more that these types of decisions are left out of your hands and subsumed by the larger power of the centralized government, the less free you are, and the less opportunity there is to practice self-government and to be a real citizen. Now, at the time of the American founding, this wasn't exactly a dire concern for the nation. As Forrest McDonald writes, the colonists had had abundant political experience. Probably more Americans have participated directly in government at one level or another than had any other people on Earth. And this experience would also be helpful for being able to recognize in those who wish to wield political power motives and interests which are not for the common good. As Publius writes, the Republican principle demands that the deliberate sense of community should govern the conduct of those to whom they entrust the management of their affairs, but it does not require an unqualified complacence to every sudden breeze of passion or to every transient impulse which the people may receive from the arts of men, who flatter their prejudices to betray their interests. A proper education in the civic virtues serves as a guard against corruption, which by the nature of republics they are highly susceptible to. As Gordon S. Wood writes, monarchies could tolerate great degrees of self-interestedness, private gratification, and corruption among their subjects. After all, they were based on dependence and subservience and had all sorts of adhesives and connections besides virtue to hold their societies together. Monarchies relied on blood, family, kinship, patronage, and ultimately fear. But republics could never resort to such force. In their purest form, they had no adhesives, no bonds holding themselves together, except their citizens' voluntary patriotism and willingness to obey public authority. Without virtue and self-sacrifice, republics would fall apart. Which brings us to the final republican virtue, public-spiritedness. Machiavelli would write in his discourses on Livy that it is not the pursuit of individual good, but of the common good that makes cities great, and it is beyond doubt that the common good is never considered except in republics. To be a truly republican man means to look out for your fellow citizen. You are not just out for yourself living an atomistic existence, you are a participant in self-government beginning in the family and spreading out into your local community, its various institutions, associations, and the local government. And one cannot be public-spirited without first being inculcated in civic activities and being educated on the responsibilities of citizenship. When you start a foundation to help people in need, or create an association to help kids build character, or volunteer at a local food bank, or simply participate in a town hall and deliberate and debate a topic of importance for your community, you are doing things in the interest of the common good. You are embodying the ideals of public-spiritedness. Robert A. Goldman writes that experience in the exercise of political rights would habituate the self-seeking individual in behavior that was moderate, considerate of others, conciliatory, civil, and compromising, very much like that of a truly public-spirited citizen. By living your life in the service of others and by sacrificing your own interests for the sake of the community, you are better able to cultivate the republican virtues and be a free, self-governing individual. But that basically covers the republican virtues. Though there is one more thing to consider. Inherent to public-spiritedness is that your energy and spirit is influenced by some ethical or moral precepts. When you engage in politics, or come to form certain opinions about what ought to be pursued in politics, or decide what is good for people, or what is good in general, those ideas and inquiries come after the fact of your moral development. Your moral development may not be complete or very sound, but you are nonetheless making political decisions and shaping your ideas of civics and policy based on your moral foundation. And this gets us to that other idea that weighed heavily on the founders and was just as important for the health and longevity of a republic: morality. If you are trying to create a national polity that respects the significance of the republican form of government, that respects the principles of a decentralist federalism, and that attempts to live the best and freest life attainable, they need to be moral people. And as Donald Lutz noted, the book that was most frequently cited by the Americans during the founding era is the book of Deuteronomy. The biblical tradition is most prominent among the citations. There was no other book on the continent that the founders were more familiar with. Colonial society was infused with the Christian culture, from their schools, their homes, their governments, and in their writings. Nearly all of the founders saw a religious education as protecting against the excesses of vice. The preamble to Patrick Henry's bill establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion states that the general diffusion of Christian knowledge hath a natural tendency to correct the morals of men, restrain their vices, and preserve the peace of society. The founders thought that the virtues promoted by Christianity were necessary to preserve the moral and civic core of the nation. These virtues, when properly adhered to, would help to tame those passionate elements of human nature. You don't come to politics without some semblance of an ethical or moral framework, be it something derived from your family, your childhood, or life experiences. But in the religious context, it's not just that you are given a set of standards or truths to follow, but that you are born with obligations. Harry Jaffa put this rather succinctly. Under Christian monotheism, each individual has a relationship with God that is prior, both logically and ontologically, to his membership in the political community. Each individual is a citizen, actual or potential, of the city of God before being a citizen of his own particular country. This changes the nature of one's responsibilities while on earth, because the superordinate duties to God means that you will be acting in a certain way to best effectuate your spiritual salvation. In the words of Paul Ray, membership in a close-knit religious association provides individuals with a sense of place, and like citizenship in the Greek polis, it brings the force of shame to bear in a fashion that encourages self-restraint, decency, and a spirit of self-sacrifice. Your citizenship in the city of God complements your citizenship to your country, and it helps to promote the civic virtues and cultivate a sense of patriotism. But take it from the founders. As John Adams said, I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation in facilitating to mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality, and consequently of all civilization. He also stated that the Bible contains the most profound philosophy, the most perfect morality, it is the most republican book in the world, and that religion and morality alone can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. Thomas Jefferson, of all the systems of morality, ancient or modern, which have come under my observation, none appear to me so pure as that of Jesus. Ben Franklin, as to Jesus of Nazareth, I think his system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. John Marshall, with us, Christianity and religion are identified. It would be strange, indeed, if with such a people our institutions did not presuppose Christianity, and did not often refer to it and exhibit relations with it. James Madison, the belief in a God all-powerful, wise and good is so essential to the moral order of the world and to the happiness of man, that arguments which enforce it cannot be drawn from too many sources. Charles Carroll, without morals a republic cannot subsist any length of time. They, therefore, who are decrying the Christian religion, whose morality is so sublime and pure, and which denounces against the wicked eternal misery, and which ensure to the good eternal happiness, are undermining the solid foundation of morals, the best security for the duration of free governments. Richard Henry Lee, the experience of all time shows religion to be the guardian of morals. Benjamin Rush, the only foundation for a useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty, and liberty is the object and life of all republican governments. Benjamin Rush also seemed to believe that any religion was better than no religion. Such is my veneration for every religion that reveals the attributes of the deity, or the future state of rewards and punishments, that I had rather see the opinions of Confucius or Mohammed inculcated upon our youth than see them grow up wholly devoid of a system of religious principles. Though even then he would still conclude, but the religion I mean to recommend in this place is the religion of the New Testament. And this last quote from John Adams is really the most profound. We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Now that's a pretty incredible statement. He's saying that this country will not function well unless its people are moral and religious. That's how precarious our Republican government is. And Alexis de Tocqueville picked up on this during his time in America. Americans combine the notions of Christianity and of liberty so intimately in their minds that it is impossible to make them conceive the one without the other. He went on to note that while the law permits the Americans to do what they please, religion prevents them from conceiving and forbids them to commit what is rash or unjust. Religion in America takes no direct part in the government of society, but it must be regarded as the first of their political institutions. For if it does not impart a taste for freedom, it facilitates the use of it. I do not know whether all Americans have a sincere faith in the religion, for who can search the human heart, but I am certain that they hold it to be indispensable to the maintenance of republican institutions. This opinion is not peculiar to a class of citizens or to a party, but it belongs to the whole nation and to every rank of society. Now, at the time of the founding, the individual states were given far more leeway in establishing their own religions. But given the sheer diversity of people, religions, denominations, and thought in America today, it is probably for the best that the individual states aren't establishing religions anymore. And there were certainly a good number of founders who thought that the states really shouldn't be establishing their own religions anyway, and over time that practice would fade away. As Madison said, religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together. If anything, Benjamin Rush's thought experiment might be more useful in today's America. Better to have some religion than none in your private life. But even then, it would be imprudent to say that areligious people aren't or can't be moral. There are plenty of atheists out there who are nonetheless very decent people. But I think something that most people need to appreciate is that even if you are not religious, but still more or less a person in line with some of the basic tenets of Christian morality, that you are essentially running off of the centuries-long buildup of moral capital that will have to be replenished at some point with a religious education. And I think George Washington's farewell address sums this point up pretty well. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in the exclusion of religious principle. George Washington is essentially saying that even if you are personally an observer of a strong moral code, that you can't expect the entire country to also be that way. Most people simply do not have minds of peculiar structure. Most of us are pretty average. But when we start looking at the specifics of how Christianity is generally practiced in the world, we'll begin to see why it was deemed so important for Republican government and civil society. If you think historically, some of the first hospitals to ever exist were attached to monasteries. The Christian monks in Asia Minor during the time of Basil of Caesarea were all required to minister to the sick and to perform charitable deeds. And in America, by 1995, there were 585 faith-based hospitals. By 2016, there were 726. And according to a 2018 American Hospital Association annual survey, more than 1 in 7 patients are cared for in a Catholic hospital in America. But on the level of pure civics, according to Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam, religiosity rivals education as a powerful correlate of most forms of civic engagement. Churches provide an important incubator for civic skills, civic norms, community interests, and civic recruitment. Religiously active men and women learn to give speeches, run meetings, manage disagreements, and bear administrative responsibility. They also befriend others who are in turn likely to recruit them into other forms of community activity. And it's not just that they're narrowly focused on religious activities, religious people are also more likely to be involved in secular organizations. Regular worshippers and people who say that religion is very important to them are much more likely than other people to visit friends, to entertain at home, to attend club meetings, and to belong to sports groups, professional and academic societies, school service groups, youth groups, service clubs, hobby or garden clubs, literary, art, discussion, and study groups, school fraternities and sororities, farm organizations, political clubs, nationality groups, and other miscellaneous groups. In one survey of 22 different types of voluntary associations, from hobby groups to professional associations to veterans groups to self-help groups to sports clubs to service clubs, it was membership in religious groups that was most closely associated with other forms of civic involvement, like voting, jury service, community projects, talking with neighbors, and giving to charity. In fact, in terms of volunteering and philanthropy, about 75 to 80% of church members give to charity, as compared with 55 to 60% of non-members. And 50 to 60% of church members volunteer, while only 30 to 35% of non-members do. Simply put, a religious orientation is vital to the health of our country, in order to sustain national morality. This is also part of what Alexis de Tocqueville understood as the American idea of self-interest well understood. Self-interest in itself would imply something purely selfish or pertaining to your own private advantage. But the doctrine of self-interest well understood, as described in Democracy in America, implies an ennobling of self-interest plus virtue. And so as Tocqueville writes, the inhabitants of the United States almost always know how to combine their own well-being with that of their fellow citizens. In this way we can avoid the sheer self-absorption that comes with the more individualistic and atomistic aspects of democracy. So in this sense, one can form the conception of self-interest well understood by means of humanitarian work, volunteer work, being fulfilled in their job as they serve others, being fulfilled in their community, or being fulfilled in their religion and their relationship with God. Christianity tells us that one must prefer others to oneself to gain heaven, but Christianity tells us as well that one ought to do good to those like oneself out of love of God. That is a magnificent expression. Man penetrates divine thought by his intelligence. He sees that the goal of God is order. He freely associates himself with that great design, and all the while sacrificing his particular interests to the admirable order of all things, he expects no other recompense than the pleasure of contemplating it. When someone joins the military to serve their country, they are not just acting out of their own self-interest, they are acting in the interest of all of us by going out there and making sacrifices to defend the country. When the Civil Rights Movement organized thousands of people and numerous organizations together under the principles of the Declaration of Independence and for the common good of black citizens, that is self-interest well understood. It is an ennobling of principle. And I think it also becomes clear how this idea intersects with public spiritedness and the other Republican virtues. The doctrine of self-interest well understood does not produce great devotion, but it suggests little sacrifices each day. By itself, it cannot make a man virtuous, but it forms a multitude of citizens who are regulated, temperate, moderate, far-sighted, masters of themselves. And if it does not lead directly to virtue through the will, it brings them near to it insensibly through habits. Now all of these things, virtue, religion, morality, and good habits, are all what is supposed to be inherent to a liberal arts education. Education was huge for the founders. As was stated in the Northwest Ordinance, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Or as the 1780 Constitution of Massachusetts states, wisdom and knowledge as well as virtue diffuse generally among the people, being necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties, and as these depend on spreading the opportunities and advantages of education among the different orders of the people, it shall be the duty of legislatures and magistrates in all future periods of this Commonwealth to cherish the interests of literature and the sciences, and all seminaries of them, especially the university at Cambridge, public schools, and grammar schools in the towns, to encourage private societies and public institutions for the promotion of agriculture, arts, sciences, commerce, trades, manufactures, and a natural history of the country, to countenance and inculcate the principles of humanity and general benevolence, public and private charity, industry and frugality, honesty and punctuality in their dealings, sincerity and good humor, and all social affections and generous sentiments among the people. And as Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, it cannot be doubted that in the United States, the instruction of the people powerfully contributes to the support of the democratic republic, and that will always be the case, I think, where the instruction that enlightens the mind is not separated from the education responsible for moral manners. But today, when we think of an education, we pretty much mean everything that goes on in grade school and at a university, without really making much of a distinction between what kind of education or the content of that education. We basically think of it as just putting facts inside of a student's head, and then after you take the test, you can just forget about those facts. But the liberal arts are something else. Martin Diamond writes that the Latin root of the word education, educere, means to lead forth. To lead forth is what we are doing when we are educating. And this is what the liberal arts were ultimately intended to do, to habituate students in the moral virtues, good habits, to discuss questions and discover what a good human life consists of, that there are truths to be found about the most important matters of our existence. And so this isn't just any kind of education. You can go to school, and the only curriculum you have to go through could be on the intricacies of pottery. Okay? I guess you can say that that is an education, but that's not exactly the type of learning that leads forth an individual. In fact, most people would probably have considered something like this training and not an education. Education is something specific. You're not learning just anything. But as it pertains to what a liberal arts education is supposed to contain, once again, Calvin Coolidge provides one of the best summations of what you're supposed to be studying. The culture of Greece and Rome, the orations of Demosthenes and Cicero, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle in the Greek and Latin classics. To be included with the classics are modern history and literature, the philosophers, the orators, the statesmen, the poets, Milton and Shakespeare, Lowell and Whittier, the farewell address, the reply to Haynes, the speech at Gettysburg. It is all these and more that I mean by the classics. They give not only power to the intellect, but direct its course of action. The classic of all classics is the Bible. And the same thing was just as true in the founding, where Thomas Jefferson noted the significance of the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc., which he said were part of the expression of the American mind, and were to be found in the Declaration of Independence, the greatest document for human liberty that man has ever created. The motto of Ohio University, originally founded in 1804 as American University and chartered by an act of Congress, is religio doctrina civilitas prae omnibus virtus. Religion, true learning, civility, above all, virtue. This was also part of the mission of John Witherspoon, theologian and president of the College of New Jersey, today Princeton, in the colonial era, who, in the words of Walter Burns, thought that the good Christian is the good American citizen, and so he made sure to give his students an education in Christian morality. And I guess now would also be a good time to make the distinction clear between the learning of science and philosophy. Most of the founders had a deep appreciation for the sciences. Mathematics, agriculture, astronomy, physics, all were important to discovering the secrets of nature and using reason to illuminate them. But in the past, the distinction between science and philosophy wasn't nearly as big as it is today, and in many ways, the science of the time was still working under the assumptions of philosophy. What we call science today would be more aptly described as natural philosophy back then, and represented by figures like Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton, and Galileo and Copernicus before them. Now, the founders loved guys like Bacon and Newton. They were the intellectual giants of their time and are at the core of the Age of Enlightenment. But this is really where we start to see science more as an empirical matter pertaining to the discovery of facts and the laws of nature, generally expressed through mathematics, whereas philosophy stayed more in the realm of values, or ontology and teleology. This is where we get our fact-value distinction between science and philosophy today, which was not nearly as strong back then, which is part of the problem with how modern science is treated as an absolute authority for man in today's world. Science can't tell you what is good or noble. It doesn't have anything to say about the humanity of man because that is a statement of value. As Harry Jaffa writes, science declares that facts and values are absolutely discrete, and that nothing can be known as to which are more choice-worthy, and hence that nothing can be known about what is the right way of life. Since what is declared concerning the right way of life in Plato's Apology of Socrates and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is regarded thereby as a mere matter of faith, the distinction between the way of knowing the right way of life in these books and in the Bible becomes irrelevant. In short, education becomes irrelevant. You don't receive a moral education from science. Science doesn't make those kinds of determinations because that's not its job. But the great works of antiquity do, the works of religions do, the humanities do. You can receive knowledge from science, important knowledge. The pursuits of science and the technical arts are a noble calling. But if that is your only concern, you are not receiving a full education on the human condition, on the moral virtues. And you should listen to Socrates when he exhorts you to regard virtue. Now, switching gears to our previous discussion of being a slave to your appetites, this is something that the liberal arts have traditionally been understood to combat. The purpose of the liberal arts is to make man free of succumbing to our basest appetites and reorienting our lives toward the good and the beautiful. As Notre Dame professor Patrick Deneen writes, for all their many differences, the authors of the classical and Christian texts all agree that liberty is not a condition into which we are naturally born, but one we achieve through habituation, training, and education, particularly the discipline of self-command. It is the result of a long process of learning. Liberty is the learned capacity to govern oneself using the higher faculties of reason and spirit through the cultivation of virtue. And a liberal arts education becomes far more important when you are living in a democracy such as ours, which is something that Alexis de Tocqueville wrote extensively about in Democracy in America. Democracies, by their very nature, are equalizing. Now, this can be good in the sense of achieving popular sovereignty and equality of rights. But when it comes to the promotion of noble virtues, or simply religiosity, you tend to run into a problem, or a tension. People living in a democracy tend to see the only source of legitimate authority the things that are the expression of the mass of people. It's kind of understood by the expression, well, everybody's doing it, but sometimes what everybody's doing might not be the most virtuous thing that one ought to be doing. The average person tends not to be habituated in the moral virtues, and they tend to be motivated more often by their passions, because they're only looking at what others are doing, or they only look to themselves. And so in Tocqueville's words, man becomes alike and equal, constantly circling around in pursuit of the petty and banal pleasures with which they glut their souls, forever thrown back on himself alone, shut up in the solitude of his own heart. This was part of Tocqueville's fear of a democratic individualism, which in our day is more aptly described as a kind of atomism or solipsism. And so as Yuval Levin writes, the liberal arts allows the individual to be exposed to higher, deeper, and more beautiful forms of knowledge than the culture of our mass democracy is likely to value. It also helps to instill in citizens judgment, character, ideals, and priorities that might counterbalance some of the excesses of democracy. Or as the motto of the University of Texas at Austin goes, Disciplina praesidium civitati, which according to Patrick Deneen is translated as, a cultivated mind is the guardian genius of democracy. And as a person educated in the liberal arts and the moral virtues, you ideally have a much better understanding of the role of a statesman. Only the individuals who have been habituated with a rightly formed conscience and are of good character can be relied upon to govern in the best possible light. This was part of John Witherspoon's curriculum at the College of New Jersey, where he wanted to prepare his students for public usefulness, and, according to one PhD dissertation, would go on to produce 12 members of the Continental Congress, 5 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, 1 US President, a US Vice President, 49 US Representatives, 28 US Senators, 3 Supreme Court Justices, 8 US District Court Judges, 1 Secretary of State, 3 Attorneys General, and 2 Foreign Ministers. And that doesn't even include all the state legislatures and judges that came out of his school. But one of the most important things that a statesman does is to pass laws, and ideally good laws. As historian Carly Conklin describes, part of what the founders thought ensured a government that allows people to best pursue happiness is to make sure that the laws that are passed are in accordance with the laws of nature. Which, in that period, when they spoke of the laws of nature, they were referring not only to the natural laws of the universe, but to the natural human capacity for reason as given to us by God, and the exhortation to virtue that that reason would entail. So if the human laws are in accordance with man's natural capacity for reason and free will, the people will be in the best condition for pursuing happiness. If the human laws are not in accord with man's natural capacity for reason and free will, then the people are not in the best condition for pursuing happiness. As Conklin writes, to pursue happiness is to pursue virtue, to pursue a life that is rightly ordered in relation to the first principles, summarized by the founders as the laws of nature and of nature's God. And it is by those laws of nature and of nature's God that you are endowed with rights. If man-made laws, or if the government itself infringes on those rights, and if they are not rectified, then the people will increasingly be in a state of subservience and indolence. The historian Carl J. Richard puts this succinctly. Classical Republicans feared conspiracies not so much because tyranny deprived citizens of their liberty, as because it robbed them of their virtue. The founders repeatedly contended that tyranny corrupted citizens by dehumanizing and degrading them. Perhaps more than any argument, this assumption produced the desire for independence from Great Britain. If the cunning prime ministers of Britain could ever convince the American people to accept the smallest unconstitutional tax, Americans would eventually lose not only the power but the very will to resist. Americans would then be no more than slaves, subject to the whims of distant masters. This is why you must always be on guard for maladministration, and for those who wish to be a proper statesman, to always be mindful of the natural and eternal laws of the universe and its creator, and of the Holy Scriptures and the human condition. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Act, and Coercive Act, all of these things infringed upon the laws of nature and inhibited the colonists' pursuit of happiness. Avoiding such infractions and modeling the best behavior possible while staying true to the civic virtues of this country is one of the most important jobs that a statesman can do. Which brings us to the final point pertaining to the pursuit of happiness, and that being how we make our living. Given the fact that the American Republic was founded on the belief that its citizens were cultivated in the virtues to a degree never before seen, the founders then had to ask themselves, how should we make our living in a way that is most fitting to develop and buttress our virtues in the Republican form of government? For guys like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, it was all about farming. Thomas Jefferson wanted nothing more than a nation of farmers, because farmers are completely self-sufficient. You grow your own food, you grow your own clothes, you build your own home, and you don't need to rely on the unstable nature of manufacturing work, or as he said, the casualties and caprice of customers. If you lose your job as a manufacturer, you don't have the skills to provide for yourself, because you're not a farmer. For Jefferson, farming was the way to becoming a truly free and self-governing Republican man. You're not dependent on anything other than your own 2 hands and the favor of nature. I mean, Jefferson literally thought that those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. Now, there is something to say about that. I mean, how many people could actually survive on their own today if they lost their office job and all the grocery stores shut down? I don't know how to farm. But at the same time, to our ears, this just sounds absurd. And for obvious reasons, Jefferson's dream of a nation of farmers wasn't going to happen. And both Jefferson and Madison would later come around to recognize some of the problems with that. So the view that would come to prevail in America was the Hamiltonian view, which meant that America was going to be a commercial republic. Why a commercial republic? Well, what is commerce? It's just trading with people, conducting business. You know what you're not doing when you're trading with people? You're not killing them. The preamble to the Constitution states that our government was formed to ensure domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. It is offering a vision of peace, peace from the religious wars that racked the previous centuries, peace from the turmoil of Europe. So if you don't want your people killing each other and you want them to live decent lives, Well, you gotta give them something to do. And that something was making money. Because money making, as Montesquieu notes, softens barbaric morals. Or again, it gets us to stop killing each other. And we've basically known this for decades now. Liberal democracies don't go to war with each other, and nations that freely trade with one another enhance the quality of life of both. I mean, we have known this since 1776. And so as Thomas Paine writes in Common Sense, our plan is commerce, and that, well attended to, will secure us the peace and friendship of all Europe, because it is the interest of all Europe to have America a free port. Though you still want to make sure you have an army and a navy, because you never know when they're coming back. But the intent of the Constitution was more or less putting into words something that already existed in America. During the entirety of the colonial era, there was just something about America that made its people more industrious. We like to work. We still like to work. Most scholars seem to say that this has to do with the Protestant work ethic, but whatever the source, Americans are simply industrious people. And so, the Constitution was intended to let people be as industrious as possible while protecting their natural rights and protecting them from foreign threats. As Publius wrote in Federalist 8, the industrious habits of the people of the present day, absorbed in the pursuits of gain and devoted to the improvements of agriculture and commerce, are incompatible with the condition of a nation of soldiers. Publius goes on to write in Federalist 12, the prosperity of commerce is now perceived and acknowledged by all enlightened statesmen to be the most useful as well as the most productive source of national wealth, and has accordingly become a primary object of their political cares. By multiplying the means of gratification, by promoting the introduction and circulation of the precious metals, those darling objects of human avarice and enterprise, it serves to vivify and invigorate the channels of industry, and to make them flow with greater activity and copiousness. The assiduous merchant, the laborious husbandman, the active mechanic, and the industrious manufacturer, all orders of men, look forward with eager expectation and growing alacrity to this pleasing reward of their toils. And so we eventually settled on becoming a commercial republic. We're gonna make some money. But you need to understand just how vilified this kind of lifestyle was, and Publius hinted at this a bit. Going back to Jefferson, he and the rest of the Republicans thought that commerce and manufacturing were tantamount to corruption, because to be engaged in trade and money-making was to pursue your own self-interest and to indulge yourself in perennial vices. As John Adams wrote, the spirit of commerce corrupts the morals of families as well as destroys their happiness. It is incompatible with that purity of heart and greatness of soul which is necessary for a happy republic. And Mercy Warren of Massachusetts thought that the thirst for wealth prepared the way to corruption, instead of that real honor which is ever the result of virtue. And even Aristotle would write that citizens should not live a vulgar or a merchant's way of life, for this sort of way of life is ignoble and contrary to virtue. And in many ways, this is still vilified today, though not necessarily on the grounds of classical virtue. And really, this is just an expression of that part of human nature that doesn't like drastic technological change, and the way that that can alter society and deracinate people. It used to be a sin to innovate, to make new technologies and improve things and make money from them. Deirdre McCloskey writes in Bourgeois Dignity that in 1397, the vested interests of Cologne outlawed the making of pins and presses rather than by hand. In 1561, the city council of Nuremberg passed an ordinance imprisoning anyone who would make and sell a new lathe that had been invented by a local man. In 1579, the city council of Danzig secretly ordered the inventor of the ribbon loom to be drowned. Like, for the vast majority of human history, making new stuff, freely trading with people, and just generally making money has not been looked favorably upon. But this was part of the problem that some of the founders faced. How do you get public virtue out of private virtue if the private activities that people are engaged in are tantamount to vice? Well, it might be useful to remind ourselves here of Adam Smith and David Hume. Alexander Hamilton read his Smith and Hume, and he knew that by and large, the mass of people would not be governed by an ascetic obedience to the public good. And so you have to find other ways to get people to work together. As David Hume would write in Of Commerce, it is requisite to govern men by other passions, and animate them with the spirit of avarice and industry, art and luxury. Now where one might read this and say to themselves, well, that doesn't sound good. Here's what you need to understand about this. The hard truth of the human condition seems to be that you simply cannot expect most people to do things because it is the right thing to do, or the good thing to do for the sake of the common good, or for their own souls. Truly virtuous people are rather few and far between, despite the incessant promotion of virtue even at the time of the founding. And so if people are more or less governed by their passions or appetites, the key is to figure out how to use those passions and appetites for good ends. And I think an example from Adam Smith can be pretty instructive here. As he writes in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, Let us suppose that the great empire of China, with all its myriads of inhabitants, was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake. And let us consider how a man of humanity in Europe, who had no sort of connection with that part of the world, would react upon receiving intelligence of this dreadful calamity. He would, I imagine, first of all express very strongly his sorrow for this misfortune of that unhappy people, and he would make many melancholy reflections upon the precariousness of human life, and the vanity of all the labors of man, which could thus be annihilated in a moment. He would, too, perhaps, if he was a man of speculation, enter into many reasonings concerning the effects which this disaster might produce upon the commerce of Europe, and the trade and business of the world in general. And when all this fine philosophy was over, when all these humane sentiments had been once fairly expressed, he would pursue his business or his pleasure, take his repose or his diversion, with the same ease and tranquility as if no such accident had happened. The most frivolous disaster which could befall himself would occasion a more real disturbance. If he was to lose his little finger tomorrow, he would not sleep tonight, but, provided he never saw them, he would snore with the most profound security over the ruin of 100 million of his brethren. So what is the lesson in this? Well, ultimately, it should show you the limitations of our moral sentiments. Millions of people can die today, right now, and in about a couple of months or weeks, we'll kind of just forget that it happened and just go on with our lives until someone says, "Hey, remember when that thing happened a couple of months ago?" And then you'll reply, "Oh right, that was sad." Hey, do you want to play Xbox? We don't just sit around every single minute of the day weeping in pain for the loss of lives somewhere where we do not see it, or where it does not have any direct and emotional impact on our own lives. Or take this with another example. Let's say that a disease has spread all across the world, and the one way to help control the spread of that disease is to wear a mask and keep your distance from people, so you can limit your own risk of infection, and in case you yourself were infected or have asymptomatic conditions unknown to you, you don't go around infecting others, out of respect for the common good and being a responsible citizen. You would think the concept is an easy one to understand, and yet we see millions of people not doing that. If people actually sought to look out for the public good every single moment of their lives, they would probably all be wearing masks. But many don't, because people are not exactly as oriented toward the common good as you might think they are, or wish they would be. Now, many people do in fact wear masks, and I would honestly guess that a significant majority do. But the fact that there are plenty of people who don't should be revealing of something. Now, perhaps if someone close to you did pass away from this disease, you would be more apt to wear a mask, compared to someone who knows literally nobody who has been afflicted and sees no reason to wear a mask. And so back to the Smith example, if a tragedy struck you personally, yeah, you'd probably be in greater duress and take certain actions that you otherwise wouldn't have taken if a tragedy struck some other guy who you've never even met before and didn't even know existed. This is because there are limitations to our feelings for others. Nature, it seems, when she loaded us with our own sorrows, thought that they were enough, and therefore did not command us to take any further share in those of others than what was necessary to prompt us to relieve them. Now, this doesn't mean that man is just a cruel and immoral creature, that we are fallen, or that we shouldn't seek to develop our moral sentiments or maintain good character. It just means that our incentives for taking certain actions are often constrained by what immediately confronts us or poses a serious moral dilemma to our own lives. Adam Smith would actually go on to write that you cannot have a functioning human society without some semblance of morality, or if people were only concerned with themselves. When we prefer ourselves so shamefully and so blindly to others, we become the proper objects of resentment, abhorrence, and execration. But where Smith thought that our moral sentiments should be directed were towards the set of laws or the legal framework within which we live out our lives, and specifically the rules that govern the economy and the incentives that they create. And this gets us to a larger point on how Adam Smith thought that the concept of morality should be viewed as an artificial mechanism to promote good outcomes. When you do good things, whether or not it is something done by habit, you are doing them because you've likely been taught in some way or another that that was a good or moral thing to do, and your justification is likely pointing toward a set of noble or moral principles. When we are always so much more deeply affected by whatever concerns ourselves than by whatever concerns other men, what is it which prompts the generous, upon all occasions, and the mean upon many, to sacrifice their own interests to the greater interests of others? It is not the soft power of humanity. It is not that feeble spark of benevolence which nature has lighted up in the human heart that is thus capable of counteracting the strongest impulses of self-love. It is a stronger power, a more forcible motive, which exerts itself upon such occasions. It is reason, principle, conscience, the inhabitant of the breast, the man within, the great judge and arbiter of our conduct. It is he who, whenever we are about to act so as to affect the happiness of others, calls to us, with a voice capable of astonishing the most presumptuous of our passions, that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. It's through these justifications that we do good things for other people. However, when it comes to the marketplace, it is difficult to try and intentionally do good things for others when you're primarily motivated by what you want for yourself. When you go to a grocery store, you're primarily going there to get food for yourself. You're not necessarily going there to better the status of the grocery store owner or the cashiers. Now, one would think that this would create a moral dilemma, but it really doesn't. Because much like our moral principles, which again act like an artificial mechanism to reinforce us to do good things, the marketplace has its own mechanisms, primarily competition and individual gain. And ironically, it is by pursuing your own self-interest, by competing with others, by seeking gain in an honest and legal way, that you actually end up bettering the condition of everyone. So looking back at the David Hume quote, it actually makes sense to motivate people along the lines of avarice in industry, or otherwise just self-interest. This is the most efficient and effective way of promoting the public good with the least amount of psychological and moral cost. But just think about this a little. This is what you do every day when you go to work. When you do your job and you do it well, you are serving others. You are giving to someone else a good or service that they wanted, and you have made them better off than they were before they encountered you and the work you did for them. You have served your fellow citizen, did you not? But here's the thing, you didn't intentionally seek this outcome. When you go to work, you're going to work primarily to make some money. You make money by doing your job and doing it well. That's literally all you're concerned before you can get off your shift and go home. Your concerns do not pertain to making the world a better place, or what is in the interest of the common good. But by simply doing your job, you have unintentionally made the world a better place. You have unintentionally promoted the common good. And ever since the theory of moral sentiments and the work of David Hume, when we've known all this to actually work, having consistently pursued our own self-interest in this way, without barriers to our liberty and property, living standards in this country, living standards across the entire world have become unbelievably better. Again, that person who you served or provided a good to is literally made better off than before he encountered you. And so as Adam Smith wrote, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher or the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their own advantages. The self-interested individual, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention, frequently promotes the interest of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. This is also what Edmund Burke described as the beneficial effects of human faults. And this is also what the political economist and philosopher Bernard Mandeville was getting at when he wrote a poem from 1705 making an analogy about beehives. Millions endeavoring to supply each other's lusts and vanity. Thus every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. But the analogy doesn't end there. As Forrest MacDonald summarizes, but the bees, hypocritically feigning discontent at having their prosperity depend on their vices, pray to be made virtuous. Unexpectedly, their prayers are granted, with catastrophic results. Avarice, luxury, debauchery, waste, intemperance, and gluttony suddenly disappear, and as suddenly, millions are unemployed. Prosperity in some depends neither upon the designs of the state nor upon the benevolence of individuals, but upon having individuals act freely in their own self-interest. Now, we're not bees, but the point is that the very fact that we are as rich as we are today and not all engaged in miserable back-breaking farm work is because of our industrious spirit and a healthy dose of self-interest and the liberty to pursue these things. This self-interest is part of our desire to live a safe and comfortable life, and so we engage in commercial activities to fulfill those desires and channel our passions into a sector that doesn't result in us killing each other, and we are literally all materially better off for it. Unless you desire breaking your back with farm work and having minimal to no medical treatments available, or even a steady supply of food, you are living a life today that is immensely better compared to the time of the founding. As much as some people will find a way to feel nostalgic about it, farming is not all that glorious. But when you take a step back for a moment and think about this in the grand scheme of human existence, this should actually be kind of humbling. Human beings are so imperfect, we are so fallen, that we can't even run an economy on the basis of virtue alone. It's just too much for us to handle psychologically. I mean, we evolved from tribes of no greater than 150 people. You cannot expect us to manage on our own the public good of over 300 million people, or the whole world population for that matter. There are indeed virtuous people out there, and it is expected that our laws are written with good moral purpose. But to expect the entire society to be virtuous is something else. And because we are so fallen, we need to manipulate our base passions for ends that are actually conducive to societal goods. So on the one hand, this should humble you as to what human beings are capable of. But on the other hand, because this actually works, and it works really freaking well, this really shouldn't be looked upon with that much disdain. The incentives of the marketplace are such that we get public benefits out of private vices, and we are all living incredibly comfortable and incredibly safe lives in this country when compared to any standard in the entirety of human history. You indulge your appetites in the marketplace, and, incredibly, we're not all dead by the age of 40 after contracting smallpox and having our backs broken from farming every day of our lives. Now, most classical republicans tended to make a trade-off between wealth and freedom. It doesn't matter if you're in poverty so long as you're free. But given the nature of America as a commercial republic, the founders had to find a way to accommodate this industrious spirit with the freedom of our new constitution. And so while people are free to engage in their self-interest, the regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation. And that deal seems to have worked out pretty well for the framers. But ultimately, deciding what it is that you want to do in your life is part of your own pursuit of happiness. It is part of what you do with your own private property, and whatever talents you may possess or choose to cultivate. And only you know what you're pretty good at. No one else can decide that for you. And no one really ought to decide that for you. We don't need the federal government telling us how to live or what is good for us. That is not its job. We instituted it so that we can govern ourselves within our states and within our local communities how we see fit while our rights remain protected and peace is promoted throughout the land. And so in connection to the previous segment on the Republican virtues, instituting a commercial republic also helps serve the ends of limited government and federalism. As Adam Smith would write in The Wealth of Nations, the statesman who should attempt to direct people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals would not only load himself with the most unnecessary attention, but assume an authority which could safely be trusted not only to no single person, but to no council or senate whatever, and which would nowhere be so dangerous as in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. And this is partly the reason why the only line in the Constitution concerning how progress can be promoted is that Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Yeah, basically, you're free to make some profits. Nice. But I think there is still something to be said about the Republican backlash to the pursuit of wealth, especially in light of the pursuit of happiness properly understood. Because the pursuit of happiness is about more than just wealth. And so there is a bit of a tension here between virtue and the appetites, but I wouldn't argue that it's that big of a tension. Calvin Coolidge has often been cited as the godfather of 20th century American acquisitiveness. Most people have probably heard the quote, "The chief business of the American people is business." And from that we get the idea that the only thing this country is all about is making money. And in many ways that's true, but that's not actually what Coolidge fully believed. And I think this next part is pretty instructive. If you continue reading that same passage, he goes on to note that wealth is the product of industry, ambition, character, and untiring effort. In all experience, the accumulation of wealth means the multiplication of schools, the increase of knowledge, the dissemination of intelligence, the encouragement of science, the broadening of outlook, the expansion of liberties, the widening of culture. Of course, the accumulation of wealth cannot be justified as the chief end of existence, but we are compelled to recognize it as a means to well nigh every desirable achievement. So long as wealth is made the means and not the end, we need not greatly fear it. And that's the important part. So long as wealth is made the means and not the end, we need not greatly fear it. But to his larger point on wealth leading to worthwhile external goods, this is obviously true. Wealthy businessmen or other elites frequently give large endowments to universities so they can continue teaching students and make sure that they have all the resources they need to cultivate their intellect. Wealth allows you to do things like getting an education, or helping people in poverty, or building a park for your community. Or within Coolidge's own lifetime, there was Andrew Carnegie, who personally gave away something close to 90% of his wealth to help construct over 2,500 public libraries, on top of giving $125 million to help colleges and other schools, establishing a scientific research institute, and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars as a patron of museums, churches, and other volunteer organizations. As Aristotle wrote in the Nicomachean Ethics, many actions can only be performed with the help of instruments, as it were, friends, wealth, political power. I mean, how many times do you hear from TV programs or other content you like that it's your donation that helps keep them going? Hi, this is Political Juice, and thanks to generous viewers like you, I can keep producing the content that you all love and enjoy. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider a donation. And for those who have contributed, thank you so much for your donation. Without wealth, so much of the stuff we enjoy in our lives would not be possible. I mean, the device you are watching this video on would not exist. Most people have running electricity in their homes, running water, a microwave, a refrigerator, a TV, a car, and a working oven. We have cures to diseases. We have some of the most incredible medical advances ever. We can fly across the continent within 7 hours. I would not have access to all of the books that I own and all of the wonderful knowledge inside of them if it weren't for what little wealth I have. Dear God, the lights are on, and they're bright. But remember, wealth is not the chief end of our existence. It is a means to more virtuous ends. As Benjamin Franklin wrote, "Wherein consists the happiness of a rational creature? In having a sound mind, a healthy body, a sufficiency of the necessaries and conveniences of life, together with the favor of God and the love of mankind." And as Aristotle wrote in his Politics, the best life, both for individuals and states, is the life of virtue, when virtue has external goods enough for the performance of good actions. And to this day, Americans as a whole still give the most to charity in comparison to our supposedly socially conscious European neighbors. Because in this country, we value charity, we value philanthropy, and we value the actions of virtuous individuals and the way in which they can make their communities and our public institutions better. We, as free, self-governing, and virtuous citizens pursuing happiness, have set up organizations like the Salvation Army, animal shelters, orphanages, and other humanitarian projects with the wealth that we have because we understand those kinds of undertakings to be in our self-interest well understood as responsible citizens. Many Americans still value those ancient virtues, and we still have a decent reserve of moral and religious capital. And in many ways, it's because we have that sense of morality and religious conviction that we aren't total commercial savages or otherwise morally indifferent about everything in our daily lives. But at the end of the day, the whole American project is just an experiment which seeks to find out if human beings can truly be left on their own to govern their own affairs in accordance with virtue and right reason properly understood. That the Republican form of government can truly secure human freedom and happiness. And this was always a very precarious idea. James Madison remarked at the Constitutional Convention that the delegates in that room were now digesting a plan which in its operation would decide forever the fate of Republican government. Alexander Hamilton concurred and said that if we did not give to the Republican form due stability and wisdom, it would be disgraced and lost among ourselves, disgraced and lost to mankind forever. And Rufus King remarked that his fears were more agitated for his country than he could express, that he conceived this to be the last opportunity of providing for its liberty and happiness. The American Constitution, the American way of life, was designed for a people who appreciated the rarity and the freedom of the Republican form of government, a form of government that seems so quick to degenerate into anarchy and despotism. It may very well be that this experiment falls apart sometime in the future, that human beings are in fact incapable of governing their own affairs. It may be that over time we will forget our sense of morality, that we will forget our obligations to our communities, that we will live a depraved existence devoid of any meaning, and that we will come to elect charlatans who lack any virtue to our most prestigious offices out of expediency or a truly irrational passion. It may be that we will come to prefer the tyranny of some sort of charming despot. As James Madison would tell the Virginia Ratifying Convention, "Is there no virtue among us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. The only thing that keeps this experiment going is you. What you do today determines the direction of this country and its institutions. What you do today shapes the character of your local community in the course of your own future. The fruits of your labor, of your pursuit of happiness, of your civic virtues and good deeds determines how much longer this experiment lasts. You are a citizen, not a subject. You have responsibilities, duties that you ought to perform. If not for your God, then for your community, for your family, for your friends, for the highest objects of civil society, for the sake of the Republican form of government, and for the sake of achieving happiness. In the words of George Washington, the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finally staked, on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people."